It's great to see everyone. And I want to welcome especially my friend Kelvin Pierce. Kelvin can share a little bit more about himself, but I discovered Kelvin one evening when I was listening to a BBC broadcast. It was called 2 minutes past 9, and it was a broadcast on the stream of white supremacy and white nationalism in the United States, particularly focusing on what led up to the Oklahoma City bomber and what has emerged since then. And Kelvin Pierce, our guest today, was being interviewed. And I thought he had such a great presence in the interview. I found out he lived in Northern Virginia. I reached out to him on Facebook, and we've chatted back and forth. I learned about the book that he wrote about growing up with a father who was a white supremacist and also an anti-Semite, and really had a missionary zeal about that. And so Kelvin wrote the book, published it. I think it was published, Kelvin, wasn't it in March or April of 2020, somewhere in there?
February, yeah.
February of 2020, right close to the lockdown. But he has an important story to tell, particularly given this time in history. And not only is it a story about his father, but it's a story about Kelvin's relationship with his father. And so Kelvin is going to open with just a reflection himself, and then we'll have some questions and just a discussion, because I think he has some things to say that is important for us to hear right now on our spiritual journey. And I've got a lot of questions to ask. So Kelvin, I just want to turn it over to you. Could you start just by sharing a little bit more about yourself, and we'll go from there?
Well, I mean, I'm just an ordinary guy who was raised in some pretty extraordinary conditions. And, I suffered greatly as a result of that. And part of my healing process, which is ongoing to this day, was to write that book and to put myself out there and try to help as much as I can. My main goal really was to get somebody to notice my book, and then hopefully get invitations just like the one I have right now to speak to people, to tell them my story, and to give hope to anybody who may be feeling similarly to the way I used to feel, and provide some tools, or at least some hope that, if I can begin the recovery from that illness, that maybe someone else can too. So I just, it's an honor to be able to tell my story and to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you. Thank you. Kelvin, you have talked about what you saw in your father as an illness, that I think it was a norm for you for a long time. And then you became aware that there was an illness to it. And you've also used the word addiction. Could you talk a little bit about growing up, what you faced, and then talk a little bit about how you emerged from it?
Okay, well, if you don't mind, I have some prepared remarks, and I'll go through that and answer
Perfect.
them. And then when I'm finished, I will answer any and all questions that you all have.
We await your remarks.
Okay, well, here I go. Again, I sincerely appreciate Father Wynn inviting me here today. It really is a privilege to have this opportunity to share my story. Many of you here may share the same concerns that I have for our society, specifically the amount of racism, divisiveness, intolerance, hate, and mental illness that currently runs through the veins of our society. In my mind, racism is fear, disguised as hate and intolerance. And even though it may appear to come in many different flavors, it is fear all the same. No stranger to fear disguised as racism. I was raised in an atmosphere of pervasive fear and hate. I know what racism looks like, what it sounds like, and what it feels like. It did not come naturally, but because I was exposed to hate daily for the first 18 years of my life, I came close to being a lifelong racist. During those early years, the most influential person in my life was my father, Dr. William Luther Pierce, physics professor at Oregon State University, of Scots Irish descent and US Southern roots. When I was 4 years old, Dad revoked his promising career, took a vow of poverty, ceased to provide financial support to the family, and devoted the rest of his life to his cause. His cause was white supremacy and white nationalism. He was referred to as the most dangerous and influential white nationalist or neo-Nazi in North America for over a 30-year period by the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League. A History Channel special details his influence on hate in America. He was one of the first associates of the American Nazi Party in the 1960s and was considered the right-hand man of its founder, George Lincoln Rockwell, until Rockwell's assassination in 1967. Dad next formed his own hate group called the National Alliance to be a political vanguard that he hoped would ultimately bring about a white nationalist overthrow of the federal government. When I was growing up, I was often consumed with thoughts about my dad. I idolized him and desperately wanted his attention and approval. But we never had anything close to a normal father-son relationship. There were no congenial father-son talks with my dad, no ball playing, no affection, no appreciation. He never played with me or hugged me or held me in his lap, and he never told me that he loved me. Every real interaction, save a few, was when he would turn his hate toward me and physically and verbally express his disappointment by beating me in a rage or with cold, calculated discipline. This treatment happened quite often, as I seemed to give him plenty of reasons. I was naturally curious and inquisitive, as children are, but I've often wondered if my escapades were a subconscious way of trying to get him to notice me. Every day when he came home from his hate work, the first question he always asked my mom was, "What did he do today?" That almost always led to Mom telling him about me doing something stupid, like setting the woods behind our house on fire, or putting Coke bottles behind the tires of our neighbor's car, or slicing up his leather chair with a razor blade. He would then send me to my room, where I would wait for many agonizing minutes or hours for my beating. He would come into my room and order me to remove all of my clothes, and then he would proceed to wail away at me with whatever caught his fancy on that particular day. It was usually a metal coat hanger, or an electric razor cord, or a 2x4. This happened so many times that I have lost count. Over time, I grew to hate him to the point of fantasizing about his death. And yet, at the same time, I wanted nothing more in life than to have him acknowledge me and be proud of me. But instead, he committed psychological warfare on me on almost a daily basis. He was a terrorist living in my home, and he damaged me almost beyond repair. He appeared on the surface as a gentle, thoughtful, and intelligent man, but below the surface smoldered a rage and fear that came out as hate, pure and simple. As a result of a childhood of rejection and abuse, I slowly became extremely withdrawn and was mostly silent around others, to the point that my teachers often wrote notes home to my parents saying they were convinced I needed psychiatric care. In 1978, Dad wrote the novel The Turner Diaries, which Timothy McVeigh acknowledged was his inspiration for the bombing of the Oklahoma City Federal Building. 168 men, women, and children died in that explosion, and over 600 were injured. The Turner Diaries has been labeled the Bible of the racist right, and it tells the story about a race war that culminated in the violent overthrow of the US government. Scenes in that book include hanging Jews and Blacks and interracial couples from light poles on the city streets. In one chapter, a federal building is blown up with a bomb almost identical to the one McVeigh used. My dad was not shy about transferring his beliefs onto me. I was taught that white people were superior, that non-whites were inferior, even subhuman. I was taught that it was wrong for races to mix, and one of the worst things in the world was an interracial couple, especially between Blacks and whites. I remember as a youngster looking at African Americans and wondering what it must be like to have Black skin and to feel subhuman like they must. I remember feeling grateful that I was white and did not have their condition. I remember seeing and hearing my dad have visceral reactions of pure disgust whenever he saw an African American on TV. He would make these awful sounds. I remember as a kid often fantasizing about going into Washington, D.C. and standing on a street corner and mowing down African Americans with a machine gun. Certainly then, Dad would be proud of me. My dad also hated Jewish people. His beliefs closely aligned with those of Adolf Hitler, and he was not shy about expressing his belief that Hitler was a man that he greatly admired. He completely agreed with Hitler's final solution. When I was a freshman in high school, I wrote a paper for my history class on the virtues of Adolf Hitler. This was a futile effort to impress my dad. I am amazed to this day that my history professor, who happened to be a World War II veteran, allowed me to present my paper to the class and mostly kept his personal opinions to himself. My dad wrote a monthly magazine called Attack, and I remember when he ran an ad in that magazine advertising that he sold guns. He labeled that ad as "Guns for Use as Negro Control Equipment." That got the attention of the FBI and most of our neighbors and led to several other beatings for me from the neighborhood kids. To the other neighborhood kids, my name was simply Nazi. For most of my childhood, I pretty much felt utterly alone and hated by all around me. I believed what my dad taught me about Jews and other non-whites and how they were responsible for so many ills of our society. I also had another essential ingredient of being a hater. I hated myself. I left home an angry young man, damaged and tortured by my thoughts, terribly shy and uncomfortable around people, unable to look anyone else in the eye and hold their gaze, terrified that they would see right through me and realize how worthless I was. The reality of it, though, was that I left home not knowing how messed up I really was, not consciously aware of having been abused, nor of all the anger and rage roiling inside. I just thought all that had happened was normal and that how I felt was normal. My dad had a disease, the disease of hate, and he infected me with it. Make no mistake about it, hate is a disease. Hate is a mental disease. It is the product of a deluded mind. This disease led me to depression and anxiety and the adopting of some pretty bad habits. On the inside, I was a miserable person, and I was also miserable to others around me because of my beliefs and how I felt. I was sick for a very long time. Fortunately, though, I finally became sick and tired of feeling sick and tired, so I sought help. At first, my attempts at healing were not very successful, but I kept searching for a path that resonated with me. I eventually settled on a more Eastern approach toward wellness. This approach encouraged me to challenge my belief system and to recognize unhealthy mind states, and to learn to let go of them and replace them with healthy ones. I learned that wellness for me was a choice. And for me, learning about the true nature of my thoughts and learning that I had a choice regarding my thoughts was crucial to my healing. I was taught early on to hate others if they were different, based on what they looked like or where they came from or what they believed in. I also believed and attached myself to all of the fearful and hateful thoughts that constantly ran through my mind. I simply did not know then that there was a different choice available regarding my thoughts. I am now learning differently. I am learning that choosing to extend love and trying to be helpful to others feels a lot better than hate. I am learning that I have a choice of which thoughts in my head to listen to and attach myself to, and that I can now choose to be happy and to feel good about myself. I can also choose love over fear and hate. I am learning that looking for love and inclusiveness instead of hate feels so much better. I also know for a fact that you cannot hate others if you truly love yourself. These two states of mind simply cannot coexist. Please understand that this was not at all easy to effect this change, as change can be very difficult, but the results are so very much worth the hard work and discipline required to change your unhealthy mindset into a more loving view of yourself and your fellow human beings. Fear, anger, resentment, and hate all control your mindset, very similar to the way addictions like drugs or alcohol do. When you hate the other, you are momentarily elevating yourself above that other, which seems to feel good at first, but you are fooling yourself, just like drugs may feel good at first, but in the long run, unhealthy mind states like these are chronically damaging to your health, just like the abuse of drugs and alcohol are. You may never entirely lose the initial cravings, feelings, or beliefs that you learned or developed, but you can indeed learn how to make a better choice. The goal is to learn to let go of your unhealthy mindsets that cause great suffering for you and for those around you, and to develop healthy ones in their place. It is critical to your well-being and the well-beings of others in your sphere of influence that you do this work. I learned for myself that my dad was wrong, and that we are far more a product of our culture and our environment than we are of our genes. I also learned that when I hated others, that I was in essence hating myself. Now I know that despite our environment, that we can indeed change and seek a better way if we choose to. Over time, I was able to shed the beliefs that my dad so insidiously instilled into me about the judgment and hatred of others that happen to look and or act differently than me. When I look at another person of color, I choose now to see a fellow human being. I still see that person's color, but instead of reacting with fear or hatred, I honor the beauty of that person and I embrace their culture and their diversity. I also remind myself that everyone is doing the best they can, given their set of life circumstances. How can I possibly judge them and hate them when I have no idea who they really are or what life circumstances shaped their beliefs? At the same time, though, I also know that systemic racism and hate is indeed prevalent within our society, no matter how much racists claim they are not racist. They are racist because they were taught to hate. They were not born with hate in their hearts. Again, that hate was taught to them. Hate is often passed on from generation to generation, but it does not have to be that way. It can be stopped cold with a simple decision that you do not want hate in your life and to eat at your heart. One vital aspect of my healing process was to write a book about my experiences. The writing of that book was a very cathartic experience for me, indeed. I will also admit that what I witnessed happening in our country during the 2016 election cycle, and then during the years after the election, was a very strong motivator for me to get this book completed. The single most pivotal moment or incident for me was witnessing the March on Charlottesville in August of 2017. Seeing those people marching in Nazi apparel and carrying torches and chanting, "You will not replace us," immediately took me back to my childhood, and it did not feel good at all. I decided at that moment that I needed to tell my story and put myself out there and try to help combat this rise in hate in any way I could. Again, I am just an ordinary person that was raised in some pretty extraordinary circumstances. I was sick for a very long time, but I am fortunate now to be on the road to recovery. I also believe that if I can do this, then others can as well. They just need to want to get better and to believe in themselves and to stick with it for as long as it takes to get well. The rewards from the hard work required are immeasurable. This healing process has become a lifelong journey for me. My hope is that in sharing my story, that I inspire others to practice love and compassion towards every human being. In closing, I would like to read a quote from the text from A Course in Miracles. When you meet anyone, remember it is a holy encounter. As you see him, you will see yourself. As you treat him, you will treat yourself. As you think of him, you will think of yourself. Never forget this, for in him you will find yourself or lose yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelvin. And I want to personally thank you for your courage in sharing your story. I think your story has a lot to teach all of us, and it's very powerful. And I think I can speak for all of us in that we're deeply grateful that for your courage in that. One facet, just to start the conversation, that there are two things that impressed me. One was that you talked about the journey of forgiveness. I don't know if these were your words, but it's certainly that your journey to liberation from your father was a journey of forgiveness. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, the first thing I did was to forgive my dad. And I've completely forgiven him. And, you know, I didn't see him very much, you know, after I went to college. I only saw him a few times. I only spoke to him a few times, but I never stopped wanting to have, you know, a normal father-son relationship with him. And, you know, when my uncle called me and told me that he had died, I cried, you know, and I was really surprised by that because, you know, of everything that had happened. But I guess I just realized that I'd always wanted to have a normal relationship with him. And then I knew that it was never going to happen. And, but, you know, another step really was to forgive myself and to kind of look inside and take responsibility. And I can't tell you how empowering that is. You know, it's certainly is a very frightening prospect to really look inside and examine, you know, truthfully, everything that you believe or have believed in, and the way you treated others and the way you treated yourself, and to take responsibility for that and to forgive that, and then decide that you wanted to reach for better feeling thoughts. You know, it was absolutely critical for me.
Thank you. Thank you. The second thing was that a part of your healing journey happened when you adopted your daughters from an overseas orphanage. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, that was a true moment of grace for me. To be honest with you, I never wanted to have kids. Never. I was scared. I was scared to death to have kids. And I felt like that if I had my own biological kids, that they might end up being just as messed up as I was or my father was. So it was something that I never wanted to do. But then when the idea of adoption came, I decided to entertain that. And the moment I saw my babies for the first time when they were 2 months old, I changed. I became a different human being. It happened instantly when I saw them. But probably one of the biggest healing things for me was, you know, a few years later when I started a foundation to work with orphans in Georgia, I encountered a lot of kids who felt really bad about themselves and about others. And when I would try to reach out to them and smile at them or engage them, and they would glare at me or turn away from me, wow, I mean, that was very powerful. It brought so much of my sense of unworthiness and the fear of rejection to the surface. And I thought I had been recovering from that, but it all just came right back up. And I was like, oh my gosh, what is this? And in examining it, I fairly quickly realized that, hey, this isn't about me. This is about these kids and their suffering. And so I brushed off that feeling of rejection, and I just kept trying, and I kept trying, and I kept trying until I would reach through to them. And then when they would lock eyes with you and smile with you, and you let them know that there was at least one other person in the world that loved them, I can't tell you how powerful that is and how healing that is.
And your foundation has done a lot of good work with these orphanages that had terrible conditions. And this is the country of Georgia versus the U.S. state of Georgia, just to be clear.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about the work of your foundation.
Well, I mean, the idea that I initially came up with was to try to give back in some small way. And I also wanted to try to establish some sort of physical connection to my daughter's birth country in case they were ever interested. And so the first thing I did was travel to Georgia and visited 12 different orphanages and decided on one to try to help. And, you know, I was scared and I didn't have a lot of confidence, and I wasn't sure I could help at all. And the orphanage that we picked was in really, really bad condition. It was, for us, probably about 50 kids there, and they were living in an old Soviet era school building that was 3 floors. And the building had maybe, I think it was 98 windows, and there may have been only 3 windows in the entire building that were still intact. There was no heating system. The electrical system was in terrible condition. There was no running water. The bathrooms were beyond terrible. And the kids were, you know, barely had any clothes. They were really filthy, dirty, and malnourished. And so I just started from day one with a little bit of help, and then just slowly grew into the point where we were able to completely rebuild that building, replace all the windows, all the doors, put in a heating system, put in running toilets, you know, water, bedrooms, beds, you know, that actually had mattresses and pillows and blankets. And it was just a tremendous experience.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine. And what are your daughters doing now?
Well, one is a police officer and the other one is a financial planner. They're both 25 years old now and college graduates, and they're out on their own, living their lives and have, pretty good careers. So absolutely proud of them.
Yeah, I hear that. I hear that. And you, I think you and your wife are business partners in you do renovations and reconstructions.
Yes, we own a design build residential remodeling firm. My wife is an architect, and so she does all the design work for the company. And then, 99% of what we do is residential remodeling.
Yeah. Well, I thank you. I want to open it up now for anyone who would like to ask some questions or offer comments, and then I will jump in if everyone's shy, although I don't think this is a shy group.
Wynn, can I ask a question?
Yes, Ellie.
Okay. I'd be interested in knowing what the speaker's father's early childhood was like and his grandparents' early childhood.
Well, his early childhood was not that great. The biggest tragedy really was that his father was killed in a streetcar accident when he was about 8 years old. And his mother was a very stern, unloving woman. His father was an alcoholic, and that was what led to that streetcar accident. And, he had to basically fend for himself and, never really experienced a nurturing or loving upbringing.
Did that answer your question, Ellie?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry I was muted. Did they come from Scotland a long time ago, or?
Well, my father was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and his parents, were from, his mother especially was from Southern elite society. I believe her grandfather was actually a high up official in the Confederate government. And so they had a very Southern way of looking at human society. And that certainly had some influence on my dad. But most of his influence that led him toward the hate that he adopted for most of his life came from when he was a professor at Oregon State University. And that's when my mom said that the switch was flipped and that he changed from a fairly normal human being into what he became.
And do you know why he switched that way?
Well, first of all, he didn't want to work. He didn't want to have a job. But my mom, really pressured him to, because she wanted him to, support the family. And so he decided that the least objectionable position, because he had just gotten a PhD in physics, was to be a professor. And while he was at Oregon State University, he witnessed interracial couples for the first time in his life. And he also started doing, a lot of reflecting on other things that were happening in our society, such as the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War and the Vietnam War protest. And he started doing a lot of reading. And unfortunately, one of the books that he picked up and read was Mein Kampf. And he started studying Bolshevism and the history of Bolshevism. And he very quickly became radicalized.
Thank you. Thank you for all your progress. That's great.
Others of you, what other questions do you all have? Sue?
Yes, thank you so much, Kelvin. I really, really appreciated your story. I was wondering how old you were when you came to yourself and realized that hate was killing you and you needed to change.
Far too long. I was in my 40s.
Were you really? Wow.
Yeah.
That's really wonderful that you were able to do this change.
Well, you know, a peer of mine actually was instrumental in that. You know, he came up to me once. He owns another company like mine, and we used to get together for sharing best practices. And he approached me privately, and he was like, Kelvin, you know, I can see the sadness in you, and but I also see hope in you. And I used to feel that too, and I got help. And he's like, I think you need to get help. And I just was like, I scoffed at the idea. And then he said something that made all the difference in the world. He's like, Kelvin, you know, your children will be profoundly influenced by your sadness as they grow up. And if you don't do it for yourself, at least do it for them. And at that moment when he said that, it was like a light bulb turned on. And I was like, you know, he's right. And I immediately sought help. The first thing I did was I made an appointment with a psychiatrist.
That's a beautiful story. Yay for that friend and showing
Yeah.
that you were open to it too through those girls. Were they sisters or just in the same orphanage together, same age?
Well, they never made it to the orphanage, thank goodness, because back then the orphanages, the kids were dying by high percentage. They were abandoned at a children's hospital when they were a couple of days old. They're 3 days apart in age, but they're not biologically related. And we were just very fortunate to get them when they were only a few months old.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And they saved your life in many ways.
They did indeed.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions or comments of Kelvin?
Yes, sir. I was wondering what the role of other people, you've kind of spoken into it a little bit with the story you just shared, but as you continued your journey and your transformation, what was the role of other people in that, in helping you through that? What was most helpful for you from other people?
Well, after I went to the psychiatrist a few times and then was prescribed antidepressants, and I made the decision at that point that that didn't feel right for me. So I went back to this friend and asked him, and he said, well, here's the name of a counselor. And I met with her and she changed my life. It was that one counselor who, what she told me was basically, you have some really awful tapes running through your head. And what we need to do is we need to rewrite those tapes. And she showed me unconditional love, which is the first time I've ever experienced that in my life. And, you know, I went through a ministerial program to become an ordained minister. And part of that program was a series of intensive workbooks about reflecting on your sense of self-worth and basically learning to love myself. And then the second most important part was reading the books that I read. You know, reading books about the nature of my thoughts, like Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now or A New Earth, very powerful for me. Probably the most powerful book that I ever read, though, was from Jack Kornfield called The Wise Heart. It's about Buddhist psychology, but it really helps you identify what unhealthy mind states are and where they come from, and then how to let go of them. And that is what really made the difference for me.
It's a good book.
My
Excellent
wife,
book.
my wife,
You.
you know, she's a very strong woman, and she was not shy at all about giving me feedback, which caused all sorts of problems, but she was very persistent. And so that was also a motivating factor to begin the healing process so that I could break the cycle of feeling rejected and acting out on that.
One of the things that impressed me in your book was also how earlier on you began to emerge from that, from the racism and anti-Semitism. And I remember the story, which I've shared with some of the folks, about your experience with, I guess it was your first boss, who was an Orthodox Jew.
Yeah, Jonah Ottensauser. I love that man. So yeah, my first supervisor when I was an aerospace engineer working for the Navy, you know, we worked in these little cubicles, and his cubicle was right behind mine. And he was, you know, I've never experienced a man like him before. And I would just watch him and interact with him. And it really admired what a gentleman he was, and how he was so loving and nurturing toward me, and how he openly accepted others, you know, without judgment. Despite his strict faith, he was just a really open, caring, empathetic human being. And, you know, I learned for myself that he was basically everything that my dad said Jews were not. And, you know, I became good friends with him. And yeah, he really made a difference in my life.
That's a beautiful story. Others of you, I'm sure you've got some thoughts or questions.
I've just got an observation, really, and I guess as an educator, but as a human being, it makes me stop and ponder. And we should do this all the time. When we meet people, we meet somebody in the street. None of us know what their background is, and you know, we all judge because that we are human beings. But actually, none of us know what sort of upbringing, what sort of nurture the people that we meet have. It just made me stop and think about that one, really.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no way that we will know, you know, until we try to reach out and get to know that person.
And even then, not everybody wants to share.
No.
So then,
Yeah. I mean, that's the way I was. When I was younger, I was completely closed. You know, I just was shy, uncomfortable, and would not talk to people. And it actually put people off because they could sense there was something wrong. And they didn't know if it was that because I was a snob or what. But yeah, people could sense that, and they didn't like that energy. And so it kind of furthered the cycle of me being shy and feeling bad and not talking to people, and then people would sense that and then not want to talk to me, and it just was further isolating.
Yeah, I was going to say that in doing that, unconsciously, you kept yourself from receiving what you needed.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Mariel, you've got to unmute, Mariel, please.
Is it better now? Yes.
It's good. Thanks.
Good morning, and thank you for being brave enough to come and speak to us.
Yeah.
I'm just interested how you found a wife with your with your attitude, because she must have seen something in you, but your affect might have been quite different than it is now. So I'm wondering how you've made it through. I wondered if you got the children before she came into your life, but it sounds like you were married at that time.
I was. Yeah, I met my wife at a summer job working as an aerospace engineer for the Navy. And because I was just a summer engineering aide, I didn't have an office. I just had a big conference room table, and she had a summer job as well. And she came down and she needed to spread out some big drawings on a table, and asked me if she could borrow part of the table. And I immediately fell in love the moment I first saw her. But you know, there are some people that, not many, but there are some people that are drawn toward quietness. You know, and I think that she was kind of took me on as a project, as it were. And so, you know, eventually she was not shy like I was, and she kind of broke the ice, and then we did start talking. And, you know, despite having a terrible childhood, I had an interesting childhood. So she was very interested in my stories, and, but she had no idea what she was getting into, not at all. And she was young. She was only 19 years old. And yeah, boy, she had no idea what she was getting into.
Great girl.
Yeah.
Do any of us, really.
Yeah.
So it takes being young and in love.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask about your career and what about that career interested you in that? And what about it helped you to continue forward despite your isolation? I too am just overwhelmed by your bravery.
Thank you. Well, at that age, the thing that I was most interested in was airplanes. I loved aircraft and I wanted to be a pilot. I wanted to be a Navy fighter pilot. And so that's why I started education as an aerospace engineer at Virginia Tech. And I entered a program that was called the Aviation Reserve Officer Candidate Program, where I was supposed to go immediately into the Navy the moment I graduated from college and go to flight school. And so that's what led to that. But when I went down to Pensacola, Florida to start flight school, I failed the flight physical because my legs were too long from my back to my kneecaps. I'm pretty tall, I'm 6'3". And they said that if I ejected from the trainer jet, I would lose my kneecaps. So they sent me back home. And then I was like, oh my God, I need a job. So I went back to one of my professors at Virginia Tech and he's like, here. And he gave me a piece of paper and said, the Naval Air Test Center is hiring. And I went there and interviewed and got a job. And that started that career. But the thing that happened is that I was working in an office all day, every day. And as a civil servant, I didn't have enough work to do. I had nowhere near enough work to do. I hate to admit it, but the Navy civil service at that time was way overstaffed. I was actually bored to death. And my wife, when she graduated 3 years after I did and got her architecture degree. She then had to work for 3 years as an intern before she could sit for her license exam. But once she passed her exam, the first thing she said was, I've always had a dream of starting a construction business. And somehow she talked me out of that aerospace engineering career. And we basically started doing decks and porches and stuff for neighbors and never looked back. And been doing it for 35 years now.
That's cool. I see making things as a real source of healing for people also.
Yeah.
That might have been an easier source of healing before you had to deal with all the
it was, and also being outdoors, as a big healer as well, at least for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So I have a question. Your book obviously is very popular with extremist group. Your father's book is very popular with extremist groups, and I'm sure he still has a following. What kind of attention have you drawn to yourself from those groups with your book?
Well, I was concerned. So far, other than some pretty critical reviews of my book on Amazon, like how dare you shame his legacy, things like that. There hasn't been any real backlash. I have gotten into a conversation with one gentleman who sent me an email, because my email address is in the book, who said, is this really Kelvin Pierce? And I responded and said yes. And he goes, well, I knew your dad really well. And he started telling me all stories of, lots of stories about my dad. And then he sent me about a 4-page long document full of mathematical formulas on how he could prove from a genetic standpoint that whites were superior. And so, and he's been respectful, and I've been respectful back, saying, human beings are way more complex than a mathematical formula. And, I don't believe these formulas, and here's what I believe in. And, but for the most part, it's been pretty okay. I did have a phone conversation with the new leader of the National Alliance, who, knew my dad well, and he did chastise me severely for writing the book. he basically said something to the effect, you know, a lot of us had pappies who beat the crap out of us when we were little, but we didn't go writing a book disparaging them like you did. And I'm like, well, you know, maybe telling a story like that might break the cycle of pappies beating the crap out of their kids and thinking it's okay. But he didn't want to hear that. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
I was so shocked when Roy Moore ran for office down in Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like that gave me a real insight into why some people were willing to, and people who are on here know I'm political, so willing to support Trump. And I realized a lot of women had fathers that were like Trump. And they married, you know, cases where, you know, young girls married at 13 to men who were much older and never had a chance to really think for themselves. That's my interpretation of what must be happening in our country. And I love that you read those Eastern books, and I wrote down a couple of them. I'd love it if you would share maybe more of your resources with Wynn and with us.
Yeah, I'd be glad to.
I'll be glad to pass them on.
Yeah, because I think I'm just real interested in your ideas of trying to break these cycles. And it's very hard. I know so many people who don't believe in white supremacy know people who, if they don't exactly believe in it, at least allow it to have more power than it should, or just systemic racism, even if it's not exactly. So many people don't want to upset the apple cart because systemic racism really works for a lot of us white people, even if we aren't white supremacists ourselves.
That is so true.
We still,
Yeah.
so there's just such a range in our society of different uses of white power. And I'm totally with you that I teach Latin and I study Roman history, but I'm also interested in American history. And I feel like so often people who are afraid of people who are different from them either don't know anybody like that, or they're in a vast minority. And in the South, the deep South, there were more people who were on like a plantation with one white family surrounded by 100 blacks. And I've often thought it was similar to other situations we see today, which I won't get into, but where there's a great deal of fear and dislike of people who are different. But our society has so many ways of covering over that.
Yeah. Well, I think as a
ignoring.
society, yeah, a lot of people don't feel good. And one way that we try to feel better is to blame others and to try to put ourselves above others. But when you don't feel good and you want to blame somebody, you know, you don't want to look inside because that's just too scary. So, and there's so much out there that you can, you know, blame. And especially when you have a leader like Trump was, you know, he vilified lots of different groups of people and made it easy for us to point at one or all those groups and say, ah, they're the cause for why I feel the way I do. instead of looking inside and being honest and say, why do I really feel this way? Yeah, I mean, I could go on forever about that. So yeah, I agree with you.
So we have about 1 more minute. Is there anyone who wants to have one burning question before we close for today? Kelvin, this was rich. Thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And you are an inspiration, and we can learn a lot from you, and so many others can as well. So I thank you for being on. I thank you for your friendship, and all I'm going to say is to be continued.
Okay, thank you for the honor of your invitation, Wynn, and for your friendship. I sincerely appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's close. Yes. Virtual applause. Let me close with a prayer. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for Kelvin, for all he's doing, and we pray that you continue to be with him, to guide him in his good work, and to watch over him, the children that he reaches out to help, and the truth-telling that he continues courageously. And I pray that God's blessing would be upon all of us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right. Have a wonderful afternoon. Enjoy this beautiful weather. And God bless you all.